because of curiosity. I'm just riddled with anxiety. I'm the lowest level as a matter of fact. I often dwell for days.
Hi, Manny. Thanks for talking to me today. So, can you introduce yourself?
Yep, my name is Manny Medrano. I'm a researcher in the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of St. Andrews.
Yeah, the reason I'm talking to you is because I'm very interested in the khipu from the Inca, which I know a fair amount about it, as far as it being a writing system, so to speak, of the Inca. But what I found really fascinating is not so much like just what it is, but you're researching whether knots and strings can communicate words and thoughts and ideas. Like, how are you managing to do that? I mean, I wouldn't even know where to begin because it's so foreign compared to the way we're used to thinking.
Well, it's a great question. And I guess for anyone who's not familiar, the quipus are knotted string devices that served the function of writing in the pre-Hispanic Andes, and were not an invention of the Incas themselves, but were invented by their predecessors, the Wari, or what they're known as, but essentially a knotted string recording device that had an over 1,000-year lifespan. Of course, there's been a roughly century of sort of detailed academic study trying to decipher the quipus, because after the Spanish conquest of Andean South America in the 1530s, at least there are no surviving written records of any Spanish, regardless actually of with a command of graphical writing, giving us a key, so to speak, to interpret the quipus that were surviving at that time, or even today, where we have roughly 1,400 of them left. And so to answer your question, it's certainly a question of entry points, right? There are about 1,400 quipus that are spread throughout over 20 countries, over 3 continents, the Americas and Europe. And it remains to be seen, really, given that not all of them have been cataloged yet, and even fewer of those have been digitized, really just where do we begin? And because our sample is limited by climatic conditions, the vast majority of quipus with known provenance come to us from the deserts of Western Peru and the Andes. And we have few, if any, quipus from ancient times coming to us from the highlands, which of course would include Cusco, the Inca capital. So the question of the bias in our surviving sample is of course relevant to consider entry points. Just the geographic spread of quipus in museums today is another relevant question when considering our entry point. And finally, just the variation between the surviving quipus themselves in different museums. Because it's difficult to say without oftentimes strong documentation from the period in question, whether we can even compare quipus from the southern Andes as compared to quipus from the central Andes, for example, that come to us from the coast. So these are just some of the sorts of contextual questions that swirl around in the heads of the 10 or so people around the world who are actively working on quipu decipherment. But to say that it's a question of starting points or entry points, I think would be the best way to classify the way, at least I think of moving forward in deciphering these instruments.
Yeah. Do you think there is, well, I'm thinking of ways you could distinguish that. Like, you could have cultural starting points, like approaching in the sense of why did the Inca develop this system with knots as opposed to letters or alphabets, or we can ask a computational question like, is there something about the nature of knots that permits writing a language that's different than using an alphabet, or maybe even practical considerations, just the materials dictating their system. So maybe as far as the cultural aspect, do you think there's something about the Inca in particular that led them to a knot system as opposed to an alphabet?
It's a challenging question given the limits of the archaeological record, right? And so when I say that quipus were the earliest recognized quipus, at least today, we attribute to the Wari state, that's simply based on our own archaeological findings, right?
Yeah.
And it's possible, and indeed there's been work for decades describing different types of inscriptive techniques in other polities of the South American Andes. The Moche state, for example, there's a debate that swirled around, particularly in the 50s and 60s, about certain inscribed beings that were found on the coast. That, of course, it raised the question of whether that is what type of system exactly that is. It's registering something, but are they game pieces? Are they some sort of early step toward a written toward a written script? And of course, those questions are unresolved because the chroniclers don't really talk to us about the Moche state. Given all of that, right, I could say that we could view certainly the environment of the Andes as facilitating the type of development of knotted registration system. Another way to say that is that the types of inscriptive systems that the Incas used were incredibly well adapted to their environment, with the Andes, of course, covering, the Inca Empire at its height covering thousands of kilometers north to south, and several modern day countries in South America. At the same time, going from the driest desert in the world in the Atacama all the way up the Andes into some of the wettest places on the continent. What type of registration system or what type of inscriptive system is most efficient given that those climatic conditions, given the constraints of sending runners along the Inca road, I would at least think is one that is durable. Cotton strings are remarkably durable given that they've survived sort of being beaten down by the sun for so many of them to arrive to us today, that they were incredibly well adapted to fulfill the functions of transferring messages, if even to inspire the person holding them to recall something from local memory over such vast distances.
That reminds me of a related question. Like, do you think there's some nature about the practicality of Inca? Do they have a certain view about the way to interact with the environment that would lead them towards like a pragmatic solution rather than maybe just some other one? I mean, based on what you're saying, it sounds like they do want to look at things practically. They want practical solutions to things, philosophically even. Would you say that's part of their thinking system or the Inca way of thinking?
It's to get into the Inca worldview, right, is one of the prime challenges of researchers of the Incas and of the pre-Hispanic times in general, in the context of South America, at least, given that this is one of the few examples of ancient civilizations where we lack the ability to read primary sources. With the exception, of course, of the early accounts written by often Spanish observers who were there shortly after the conquest. But I would think it's important to really sort of hammer home that the distinction that at least many people think of between so-called administrative quipus and perhaps quipus with some sort of spiritual or ritual aspect is really a construct of modern research. We're just not sure to what extent quipus fulfilled compartmentalized functions. The chroniclers give us mixed messages and really contradictory ones quite often, that there was one quipu per type of good that was recorded, or that there was one quipu per certain number of people that was used to record demographic information. But what we've extrapolated from those sort of scattered and mixed assertions by the chroniclers is really a set of modern constructions in how we think about quipus and how we think about the social and political administrative functions that quipus fulfilled in the pre-Hispanic era, right? So I think I would just end this comment and saying that one of the most popularly circulated sort of ideas of quipus and how they worked was that today we have deciphered, whether it's 2/3, 85%, whatever the number is that's often used, that 2/3 of quipus are numerical in nature and that the remainder forms some sort of narrative, sort of enigmatic system. But the distinction between a so-called numerical quipu and a so-called narrative quipu is, again, and I'm not the first to propose this. Alejo Rojas, who's a prominent Peruvian archaeologist, is also a strong proponent of this idea, just that to call a certain class of quipus numerical and to call another class so-called of quipus narrative is really more a reflection of our own modern decipherment efforts and our own modern study of quipus than it is a reflection of the objects themselves. And in fact, to call a quipu narrative, often in practice, is just really an assumption that because its knots do not conform to the type of style of knot that was deciphered by Leland Locke about 100 years ago, the base 10 system that you'll read about in the news, that therefore those quipus must be narrative. But we don't know that for sure.
The way I'm interpreting that is that the Inca conceptualized even recording in very different ways than we would even imagine in the West. That even their purposes of recording are different than ours. So we surely want to see in terms of administration narrative, but in a way, it sounds like you're saying that you don't necessarily distinguish between narrative and administration in the Inca culture, perhaps, that they don't need to make those distinctions. Or I'm even thinking maybe the administration is an aspect of their narrative in the sense that they seem to be a very collectivistic culture, relatively speaking. Like they have a lot of, they see a lot of power in the government, and in a way, so we would consolidate in that in a way, like administration narrative. So they're like the same thing. That's along the lines I'm thinking of.
And I think you're, I directionally, I agree with what you're saying. I think that my comment is certainly not to say that the Incas that the Incas never had quipus that served very specific and compartmentalized functions, but that the sort of inverse statement that to say that the Incas or that the surviving quipus only fulfilled very specific compartmentalized functions is not the best way forward.
Yeah. So the other way of analyzing what there that I mentioned was in more of a logical or computational sense. And do you think just in a theoretical sense that what could knots convey that an alphabet could not? Like computation speaking, or even cognitively for the people using it?
And that's a challenging question. I mean, if you were to consider it from a pure just number of states question, right? There are no two quipus that are identical, right, in any surviving collection. And the data storage capacity of a quipu is profound. I mean, the only prominent published estimate is Bill Conklin's. He consulted a mathematician when writing a book chapter in 2002 and reported the result from the mathematician that each pendant cord or each cord that hangs down from the horizontal parent string can take 8 million different combinations. Right. So when we talk about what a knot can convey, or how many, we're really talking about various pathways that happen within a certain number of states. And to speak of a quipu is to speak of a profound number of potential states. So if the question is what can a quipu, so to speak, convey that an alphabet cannot, well, I would have to think one is a mixture of numerical and narrative information, right? If you talk about alphanumeric characters, obviously, then that sort of defeats my answer. But from the pure perspective of having a distinction between letters and numbers, a quipu, in some sense, collapses that distinction because it's sort of thrown us for a loop after all these years. And granted, I think so much of the challenge, right, has been moving past modern constructed or just assumptions that researchers often encounter when beginning their studies of quipus that involve compartmentalized understandings of alphabets and numbers and of speaking and of reading as being separate processes, when in reality the material construction of a quipu sort of invites them all to be mixed at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Can you, a piece of paper nearby where maybe demonstrate or draw an example of a knot that, or like you were saying, the horizontal bends and things like that?
Oh, gosh, I don't have paper handy. I can describe as best I can. Just that, and so your question is just in terms of the variation that any given knot can take to sort of speak through that a little bit.
Like what variations are there for each knot?
I think the best example of that is the numbers 2 through 9 exclusively in the canonical base 10 numerical khipu system that was deciphered about 100 years ago by Leland Locke, who was a science historian based in Brooklyn, New York, uses three types of knots, three general types of knots. The first is an overhand knot, which is what we're most familiar with. If you have fishing line and it gets tied accidentally, that's an overhand knot. A second type of knot was called a figure 8 knot, and it's called that because the way it is tied makes it so that it ends up looking like an 8, and that's signed with the number 1, somewhat confusingly. The overhand knots, I should have mentioned, sign everything in the tens place and higher. That leaves us the digits, the units 2 through 9, which were signed by a type of knot that we now call a long knot, which is really just a kind of a modified simple knot that is just, instead of being tied once you pass the cord through itself once, instead you wrap the cord around itself between 2 and 9 times before finishing off the tie. So the best comparison visually I could have, or I could propose, is to a closed fist where each of your knuckles is one of the turns on the knot. Now, of course, if I had between 2 and 9 knuckles, that'd be easier to show. But in such a, so obviously there you have the variation of the 2 to 9 turns, assuming we're restricting ourselves to the sort of canonical use of that type of long knot. But it has other sites of variation as well, because its final tie can either be to the left or to the right, which means that the backbone of that knot has an axis that either goes from top left to bottom right or from top right to bottom left. And we just in practice refer to those as S and Z directions because the horizontal line sort of looks like the backbone of either the letters S or the capital letters S or Z. And then beyond that, the last sort of site of variation is that it can be tied with the final tie, leaving a straight end of the cord that either protrudes upwards or downwards from the knot, right? And so we have possible sites of variation in the number of turns between 2 and 9, again, restricting ourselves to the sort of standard canonical system or type of long knot. We have a left or right final tie direction, which we call S and Z. And then we also have a so-called up or down direction that refers to which end, from which end protrudes the straight part of the cord. And that doesn't even get us to the question of color, right? Which is not intrinsic to the construction of the knot itself, because oftentimes, or most times, the entire cord with whatever knots on it is the same color. But certainly we also have examples in museums or of khipus in museums that have small bits of fiber that are tied into the turns of this long knot, right? Perhaps a piece of fiber is stuck in between, you know, the second and third turns, or even long knots that change color halfway through halfway through their construction. So these are all sites of variation, and as for what they all mean, really the only one we're certain of is the number of turns, and that's only within the context when we're confident that that knot is a number between 2 and 9.
Yeah, when I'm thinking about that, it seems so hard to see how you could make that into something definite. Like, but yeah, it just seems so hard to solve, of course, because, and you're, like, as you were saying, there are a huge variety of meanings you get from it, or at least a number of signs you could derive from it. Do you think that, I mean, there is, well, do you think it could even be translated from something? Like, could you go from, like, a Rosetta Stone? Do you think such a thing is possible with the khipu? Because in a way, I'm not sure if it would be, because it's so substantially different than any system. I don't know if you could translate from like letters to knots. The only way I think you could do it is probably asking a person. So I'm not even sure if you could have a translation.
It's of course we all want to find the so-called Rosetta rope, right? That would get us to a system that we know how to interpret. I think one of the strongest candidates in that regard are what we could call paper quipus, which is a term, sort of descriptive term, referring to after the Spanish conquest, in the first few decades after, so roughly the 1550s, native Andean peoples were often filed legal suits in Spanish courts for a variety of purposes, but often to seek compensation and various privileges within the early colony. And during those suits, some claimants brought with them quipus that they read out loud as evidence. In those moments, the quipus were read out loud in Quechua or Aymara, most likely. There was a court interpreter who was often native, who translated what it was said by the quipu kamayak, or the cord keeper, into Spanish, and then a Spanish scribe wrote down into the record what the interpreter was saying. I've worked for the last couple of years with the surviving corpus of those written transcriptions, or paper quipus, and I view them as one of our best chances to find our sort of our Rosetta rope, so to speak, right? To find a match between one of the entries in one of those written transcriptions and a numerical value that's registered on a quipu that today might be in a museum in Tel Aviv, it might be in a museum in Scotland, or it might be in Berkeley. And we just don't know that. Granted, not all the quipus, the surviving quipus in museums and private collections, have been digitized to the point where those types of explicit searches, right, between written documents and artifacts can even be completed, because so many quipus are yet to be cataloged and digitized. But it's one of our most promising entry points, I guess is what I would say there. But it's also a computationally expensive sort of search, right? Because you could go initially on the assumption that one document would match one quipu, but we have no reason to suspect that that is the way it would be done. And from some of these transcripts, we know that several quipus were read out. So what's to stop us from thinking that, in fact, one document could match 2 or 3 quipus? There's no reason to suspect that there's a one-to-one relation between the two bodies of evidence.
Yeah. As far as the computational end of things, how do you use computation methods in ways that you couldn't do just by these more traditional anthropological methods?
Yep. Certainly there are multiple avenues, right, in any decipherment pathway. And I haven't really spoken to it so far, but there absolutely have been, over the last decades and really over 100 years now, efforts to speak to modern users of quipus in the Andes, which at least through the 1950s, it's generally considered that quipus, both numerical and some other functions, were still in active use in many communities, particularly in the highlands. But even today, there are quipus that are still used for ritual funeral purposes in certain often central Indian villages, right? So researchers like Sabina Hyland at St. Andrews, Frank Solomon, who's American, as is Sabina, but based in Scotland, have gone to communities to speak to them about their quipu traditions. But computationally then, the question becomes, right, in the past, people have gone to great lengths to inventory and to catalog quipus, but digitization, and I've written on this topic before, in my view, should be something more not reducible to conservation and diffusion, but that quipu databases should be viewed as objects of analysis in themselves, right? Not just as platforms for preservation. And so for that reason, some of the types of projects I've been working on include that matching process that I just described about the paper quipus. But they also include efforts to study the paper quipus, for example, at larger scales, to see if there are any patterns in the order of items that appear in the readouts of quipus, to see if that might tell, excuse me, if that might tell us something about the structure of the quipus that informed them, or even to, for example, see if there are any patterns geographically, chronologically, in the types of information that we find registered in these written transcriptions, right? And these are all questions that, while people have written and even hypothesized regarding to these questions in the past, they've done so using essentially small samples of documents that were available to them, or small samples of quipus that were available to them. So what I've called in a recent article an aggregative turn in quipu studies, that is, in my view, just the often implemented but similarly often unacknowledged idea that we might gain something in our study of quipus by comparing large samples of them, right? And not basing our analyses solely, at least, right? Because their studies of individual quipus are important in their own right, but that are the field studies should not be reducible, right, to studies of small samples.
Right. I was thinking as far as the cognitive aspect of things. I mean, I've heard theories that the quipu could primarily be a mnemonic device to help remember things. What's the evidence regarding that so far that you know
of? Well, I think it's pretty undeniable that quipus had mnemonic aspects, right? Insofar as they help the user to remember something about what was registered in it. In other words, I think it's not a radical claim to say that quipus were not explicit, were not in every case fully explicit recordings of the information that was intended to be stored in them, right? That they were not exact transcripts, right, of what the user had in mind, and that when read out, the same quipu read by two different people would produce a different, at least slightly, right, different oral reading. So in that sense, right, quipus have mnemonic aspects, and I think that's not controversial. What has been problematic in the past, in the view of many quipu researchers, is the idea that quipus are essentially rosaries, right, just in the Andes, that they are they represent a fixed set of memorized information that is then produced by whoever has it or is holding it, and that if you give a quipu from user A to user B, there's no chance, if they are not part of the same, using the rosary example, if they're also not Catholic, that they will have no idea what it says, right, or what information it records. But that interpretation is infeasible, at least in my view and in the view of other researchers long before me, because we know from the chronicles and from archaeological evidence, even because we find quipus at prominent Inca storehouses, that it would have been inconceivable that an empire with over 10 million people could have been administered by an instrument that was only understood by one person, by the person who made each one. Occam's razor tells us that that is not the most plausible interpretation, right, of how the quipus functioned. Now, of course, Frank Solomon has phrased this well in saying that when we ask, did quipus do X, did quipus do Y, did quipus do Z, and sort of adapting his words, not exactly, but the answer is usually yes, right, in the most general sense, because they were used by such a wide number of people. And I should clarify that even though they're most popularly or sort of famously associated with Inca bureaucrats, quipu literacy was widespread. That's uncontroversial in terms of after the conquest, but even in Inca times, that's an argument, not an assumption of mine, but I do think that quipu use, similarly to how any number of us might, or who are computer users, might know what an Excel spreadsheet is and what it looks like. But of course, that doesn't make us certified accountants, right? There are multiple levels of quipu literacy. And what might have happened is that many of the quipus that have survived until today do have more prominent mnemonic functions or more limited information that was registered in them. And that some of the more complex quipus that recorded demographic information, or according to the chroniclers at least, historical information or dynastic information, just didn't survive until today. So yes, it's sort of it's been easy for some researchers in the early days of quipu studies to say that quipus are mnemonic instruments and nothing more, or that they're simply rosaries. it might just be that we don't even know what a royal historical khipu would have looked like. So it's difficult for us to say that they never would have existed, in part because we've never seen one before, at least potentially.
What I imagined by mnemonic as well was that, so there's the Roman and Greek technique of method of loci, the main idea just being that you imagine locations in an environment and map things you remember onto that. So it's more dynamic, that it's not about remembered symbols as much as you've got little areas to put things that can be remapped and altered over time. And I was almost thinking of that in a way that khipu can be seen relatively similar, that in that the knots are themselves locations in a sense, in that by having those locations, you could map your ideas into a sequential and linear way. But on the other hand, of course, you would still need to know how could that be applied to other people, because you would be using your own mappings. So, I mean, it seems like it might be related to that sort of issue, or at least that might be what a lot of what you could do with the khipu.
It's I think it's, when we're speaking of khipus, it's generally whatever speculation any researcher might have most likely could and would have applied to any subset, however small or large, of khipus that were in use at some time, right? And so it's certainly, I think it's risky, I think, to immediately throw out certain interpretations of the khipu. And granted, the khipu has inspired no shortage of interpretations that run the gamut of of theories, of interpretive lenses, whatever you want to call it, over the last several centuries, given in part to the fact that we don't have strong, clear descriptions of how khipus work from the early chroniclers. And so it really gets us to, I think, the central point, or the central sort of question that's facing decipherment researchers today, at least in my view, is that we lack the ability to, at the moment at least, to confidently form a typology of all the surviving khipus in museums and private collections. We cannot yet, with confidence, point to a khipu in the Berlin Museum or in the American Museum of Natural History in New York and tell to someone who's asking us that right there is a khipu that registered the entry of grain to a storehouse, right? Or that registered the production of chicha or corned beer. And that's pretty specific, but at the same time, we're still not able to say that that khipu was one that registered numerical information relevant to administrative purposes versus that khipu is one that registered demographic numbers, right? And so even if we're confident in reading or interpreting the khipus with standard sort of canonical numerical knots, we're facing a challenge in that, insofar as that I think in order to continue moving forward with some level of confidence, right, we need to be dedicating a lot of energy to the question of what a khipu typology might look like. And that's not to say that it's never happened before. There certainly have been attempts in the past, and it's not to discount them. It's actually to say that they need to take a more prominent place in khipu research, right? Because we should continue to build upon them and develop the sort of contours of what we view certain types of khipus are versus others. That, of course, might sound a lot like what I said a little bit ago, that we should be careful of, right? Which is that there are numerical khipus, there are narrative khipus, and that we're starting to bucket things. I would just view it as categorizing khipus is not problematic in my view. What's problematic is categorizing them based on our own interpretive categories, right?
Right.
So it's what that is to say is, at least aspirationally, there needs to be closer work with the surviving objects themselves. Right. And that's not to say that anyone who wants to work with khipus has to go to a museum storehouse and work with them. It's just to say that there is a really distinct importance to working with the artifacts themselves, because the artifacts themselves can inform, in my view at least, in a more nuanced way, these sort of in our where we are now, right, which is our sort of early stages of forming more confident typologies, forming more confident classifications of the surviving khipus.
Going off the idea that either a typology or a categorization, and I do think that would go a long way in clarifying things. Because on the one hand, you're right in saying, of course, that there are probably as many ways that a khipu could potentially be read, especially on our level of knowledge. But on the other hand, in order to have any meaning, there has to be a constrained space of concepts, I guess, where a constrained area where there's only specific meanings, because otherwise it can mean anything at all, in which case it would mean nothing because there'd be no way to distinguish. So, I mean, are there things, like to what extent do you think khipus are constrained in their meaning, or to what extent are they almost infinite in their potential? I mean, I know that's a pretty broad question, but I guess that's more computational, like do knots permit more interpretations than alphanumeric.
It's challenging because we don't know, even if you want to totally axe the question of cultural context and consider it as a purely computational question, we're not yet sure which constraints we can impose, right, on how many configurations a knot can take, because those, whatever constraints we could come up with would be based on the surviving artifacts,
True.
right? And so but that's of course why we have to introduce cultural context. And of course, any serious researcher should start at cultural context. And it's what anthropologists have been doing for decades, in the over a century, in the study of khipus, really. So in that sense, yes, I do think cultural context, well, their contexts of use when they are available absolutely do help to bound the set of possible interpretations. It's rare, but we do have khipus with strong archaeological provenance. And the most prominent recent example being dozens of khipus recovered from an Inca military garrison on the southern coast of Peru called Inca Wasi, where Alejandro Chu and Gary Urton, two archaeologists, discovered khipus that were stored along with within baskets of the goods that they recorded, or that they presumably recorded. So a khipu was found, for example, on top of a pile of chili peppers. Another khipu was found on top of a pile of another type of produce, right? And so in that example, and they wrote a paper subsequently where they argued that I think it's the number 15 repeats over and over within each chord group on those respective khipus, that was actually, we can look to it as an independent invention of taxation in the Inca Empire. It could, of course, also just be a proportional share of seed that's taken out for the harvest, right, or for planting for the next cycle. But the point is that those interpretations are only possible because of the constraints that are imposed by the context in which the khipus were found, right? That's a good case study, I think, for the sorts of where we can aspire to be with at least the khipus for which we have strong context. There are other khipus that have been discovered in situ in mortuary contexts, buried with mummies, and those raise any number of interpretations. But the point just being here that yes, there is absolutely something we can take away from context. And the glass half empty way to view it is that any khipu that sort of sits decontextualized in a German museum or in a Swiss museum, wherever, is just a sort of a bucket of infinite potential states. And for that reason, we can't interpret it.
Right.
I view it as a glass half full from that perspective. And because, you know what, once we do have a small set of khipus with confident context, and once we've even reached a more confident interpretation of those few, khipus, nothing stops us from beginning essentially what is a pattern matching exercise to look out from the small sample of khipus for which we're confident about and begin to look for other khipus that in their morphology, in their colors, in some sense are similar to the ones that we've identified with more confidence. So in that sense, and I use this sort of extended analogy in a book I have coming out later this year in Lima, but one can consider it like a bookstore that's been ravaged overnight, right? And if you work at that bookstore and arrive the next day only to find half the books missing and all of the titles of the different genres gone, and you can't read the language that the books are written in, essentially the problem of resorting the shelves, I would say in resorting the surviving khipus, is to pick up one book at a time and essentially to begin to get a sense of what each one is about. And over time, as we begin to reshelve our books, or khipus in this case, in our own sort of meandering way and gradual way, we might begin to arrive yet again at sort of well-ordered shelves, a well-ordered typology of khipus.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of other aspects of solving it or decoding them that mentioned. I think historical, maybe. Are there other systems that are like in the same genus that is? Do you think that khipu are just one species of a type of knot system? Are there other cultures that you could use that have used knot systems that could help you in understanding what the khipu system could mean?
Knotted cords are certainly not exclusive to the Andes and not exclusive to the Incas. It's well attested that in ancient China, knotted cords served some sort of administrative, in some case dynastic function, is my understanding. There are examples of knotted cords being used in the Pueblo Revolt in the southwestern US. And I do think, though, it's not controversial to say that khipus are generally considered to be the most complex knotted string recording technology, at least documented in recorded human history. And so for that reason, right, it's difficult to gain insight from a lot of other knotted cord traditions, because oftentimes they are simple counts of days leading up to a revolt in the case of the Pueblo Revolt, or of purely mnemonic information. So again, to the rosary example, but there absolutely have been attempts at proposing decipherments of khipus that have arrived from a whole range of disciplines. A British engineer named William Burns Glynn was very prominent for his interpretation of khipus as a syllabary, which has not been taken up more widely since he wrote it. Another engineer, Oscar Chambi Pumacahua, who's a Bolivian, proposed something of a similar system. So engineers have taken an interest in khipus before. Certainly linguists have been interested in them, given that it's still uncertain to what extent there's a relationship between khipus and spoken Quechua or spoken Aymara, which are the two largest Andean native language groups. And historians have also had a large role in studying khipus, given that many of our best records of how khipus function are the chronicles, right, and are early archival sources. So to say that it's a large tent, I think would even still be understating it, because there are people attacking the problem from any number of different disciplines and from any number of different trainings. And it's certainly not to say that progress in any one lane of our decipherment highway is mutually exclusive with progress in any other. But I do think they all fulfill the same sort of shared, they all share momentum in the sense that they move us closer to one day, hopefully being able to interpret at least more of these primary sources that have survived.
What have you solved so far, or most recently, or maybe what is most promising that you're working on?
I think in the last few years, I did publish with Geared an article in which we found that a set of 6 quipus from the north central coast of Peru that Urton had previously hypothesized are a match, so a potential Rosetta match to a 17th century census document. I found and wrote up with him the possibility that the so-called attachment knots, which is a type of knot with, if you have your horizontal string and then a string that hangs down from it, the type of knot that is used to attach it to the parent right there, the anchor knot, so to speak, can vary in one of 2 directions. And we hypothesized that the binary direction of the knot was a marker of a social affiliation, of a binary social affiliation in the village where the census was taken. That is, that if the cord was tied in one direction, that would signify that the person in question that the cord was referring to was from the upper part of the relevant, from the community, and that if it's tied the other way, that they came from the lower part. That's an example. Recently, my work has been on the so-called paper quipus that I described earlier. And I have a couple of papers out, one earlier this year and then one at the end of 2020, hypothesizing how scribal corrections in those transcripts might be clues of how quipus were actually read in the moment, that they might register mistakes that were made by cord keepers, potentially repeating a cord by accident that was then put in writing by the scribe and then erased and fixed, or even the examples of what the quipu readers did not say, and that was clarified by the court staff, because we have examples of annotations that are added in the margins or sometimes in between lines in these transcripts. And at least I've correlated those scribal markings with potential sort of interpretive, potential slippages that happened in that moment of quipu translation in these Spanish courts in the early decades after the conquest. So those have been recent and recent sort of advances that I've proposed, or that sort of I've put out there for consideration. And I should say, granted, that with any type of decipherment research, I think to speak of quipu decipherment cannot be separated from using the word speculation, right? Because so much of forward progress in the field is based on some level of healthy but informed speculation, based on the limited, the fragmentary evidentiary universe that we're faced with, whether it's only a little over 1,000 quipus or whether it's scattered folios in archives that have sort of passing references to quipus. And other times we have administrative archival documents from that period after the conquest that have long lists of numerical information that were provided by Andean informants without even using the word quipu. In those cases, should we just assume that the information was originally recorded in a quipu that was then read out to them, or should we not? These are all questions that remain open. And I think it's funny when Locke, the fellow from Brooklyn who deciphered the numerical quipu knots, the base 10 system, when he published his most famous book in 1923, in the foreword, the fellow who wrote the foreword wrote that Locke has unlocked all of the mysteries of the quipu, and that there is nothing more to be learned. That sort of interpretive confidence of 100 years ago is perhaps what I would caution most against, right? That there's a healthy sense of being humbled by the type of problem we're facing. That while we should welcome new advances, we should also remain attentive, right, to our own slippages and and remain open to experimentation. These are all things that our so-called decipherment pathway entails, but at the same time, they're what make me so optimistic about the future of research on quipus, because they inspire such just a natural sense of curiosity in people, and really just pave the way, I think, for so many up-and-coming scholars, for older scholars to move forward with that shared momentum that I mentioned earlier.
Given that there's so much complexity to this, what drove your interest in the quipu to even study? I mean, you're going for a PhD now, even. That's a lot of time and effort and focus on one subject. What brings you so much interest in the khipu, especially for you personally?
Well, I was introduced to it in part because of my training. I have an undergrad degree in applied math. And so I arrived at the problem in part because I learned about it in a survey class I took at Harvard in 2016. And from then, I've been working on the problem ever since. And from my perspective, of course, now that I sit in an anthropology department, even having been raised, so to speak, in an applied math department, it's fascinating to me precisely because the khipu crosses so many of our disciplinary boundaries. Because it perhaps interdisciplinary is the word of the year, the decade, the century in academia, and what more appropriate thing to study than an interdisciplinary object? And it's for that reason that I don't view the label or whatever you want to call it of interdisciplinary as something that I sort of, well, I view that the label's provided by what I work on rather than coming from me in some sense. So that's what's from the beginning interested me so much about khipus. And I should add as well that it's whoever's researching khipus comes to the field with their own sort of motivation and their own sort of inspiration. And for me, at least, it's to me just it's uncontroversial that the fact that we have yet to be able to write a history of the Incas from their own words or their own records and cannot persist, right? That reality needs to be resolved, and the way we're going to do that is to decipher and read, even if it's just a few of the primary sources of the Incas.
Maybe a related question is, I mean, yeah, I see all the historical value and the interpretive value of understanding what the khipu is, or the meaning of it, or cracking the code, so to speak. But do you think whenever that may happen, like whenever it is solved, even it's like 100 years from now, do you think what potential do you think that would allow? Do you think it would create a new understanding or perspective for technology, or what kind of advantages besides just historical or interpretive things, like could it bring some new understanding to an existing problem for the future technology?
Yes, I mean it's it is certainly not just a one-way street. I guess is another way of saying that that khipus have already in the past influenced the development of American technology, and worldwide technology as well. But for example, IBM in the 1930s ran an ad in the magazine of the American Chamber of Commerce that described, or at least compared, khipus to a new type of accounting machine, a sort of cash register, essentially, that they were selling. There's evidence that khipus influenced the development of Braille in Edinburgh in the 19th century, right? So it never has been a just solely a one-way street, right? And khipus have certainly influenced in very direct ways the development of various modern technologies over the last couple of centuries at a minimum. And so in that sense, I don't think necessarily that it's something where we can only think of the khipu as influencing technology in the future. And it's a project I look to undertake in the future, in the in the years to come. But khipus have influenced us already in ways that we may not even be certain, that we may not even know about. As I guess is the message here. But yes, khipus have certainly they've been compared to databases before. They've been compared to calculators. They've been compared to books, and they've been compared to abacuses. So the question is, right, if an object has been plausibly compared to so many inventions that we're used to seeing in our modern society, what a profoundly impressive object that must be. And
Yeah.
just the realization of that, I think, is so powerful.
I was even thinking if you could be able to create a new knot system that might be able to be applied to, say, computer technology or a different way of a computer's reading information. It's theoretically speaking that you don't have to represent things with computer in strictly even like letter systems or binary, because you really could reduce letters to binary anyway. But it would seem like it could even apply to quantum computing in the sense that it seems like there's so many more potential meanings of symbols than letters even. Like even not seem to have so much more stored within it that maybe methods with solving the khipu could be used for new ways to think about quantum computing.
I wouldn't discount it. I'm definitely not the quantum computing expert, but I certainly could speak to one.
Yeah, it's all exciting stuff, I think. But I'm really fascinated with the khipu, and there's a lot of potential in it just to understand human culture even and cognition. Just how do you think about the world, and writing systems are a big part of that, I think.
I agree. And thank you again for the invitation to speak with you. And I should say also, I'm actively involved in a lot of public engagement efforts surrounding khipus, because it's another firm belief of mine, besides just myself working with digitized khipu data, that images of khipus, that information related to khipu should be available online for free. And so if anyone who will listen is interested, there are a couple of really interesting resources. Are the Khipu Field Guide, which is online. You can Google it by Ashok Khosla, as well as Google Arts and Culture in collaboration with Mali, the Museo de Arte de Lima Art Museum, have just launched a new project called the Khipu Keepers that I've contributed to as well, that put over 100 resources online. The Google project, just for free and available in bilingual, so in both English and Spanish. So just some resources for whoever might be interested. But thank you again for the invitation, and it was great to talk to you.
It was a great cover. Like, I learned so much. I learned a lot. Yeah, thanks for talking to me.
Thanks again.
Have a good day.
You too.